Billionaire accuses nanny of theft, but baby's camera reveals the truth. The polished marble floors of the Winslow estate gleamed under the morning sun, each reflection a reminder of the wealth that pulsed through every inch of the mansion. Massive chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks above the grand hall, and in the center of it all stood Lawrence Winslow, real estate mogul, billionaire, and a man whose temper could ignite a room faster than the fireplace behind him. Across from him, Olivia Turner clutched her hands together, the crisp blue fabric of her nanny's uniform taut over trembling fingers. She had worked in the Winslow household for 11 months, enough time to know when the storm was coming, but never enough to be prepared for it. "What were you thinking?" Lawrence's voice was sharp, a whip cracking in the air. "Do you take me for a fool? Jewelry doesn't just disappear." Olivia's lips parted, but no words came. She wasn't sure if he would even hear them over the roar of his accusation. Somewhere in the back of her mind, the quiet coo of baby Amelia drifted from the nursery upstairs, a sound that usually softened her heart, but now only made her chest ache. "I would never steal from you," Olivia managed, her voice steady but low. She met his glare, her dark eyes refusing to drop. "Not from anyone." Lawrence slammed his palm against the table between them. "Don't lie to me, Olivia. My wife's diamond bracelet is gone, and you're the only one who's had access to her room." The butler lingered in the doorway, avoiding eye contact. Two of the housemaids peeked from behind the grand staircase, whispering. The air was thick with silent judgment, and Olivia felt the weight of every glance pressed down on her shoulders. Her mind raced. She'd been nothing but loyal. She'd rocked Amelia through fevers, soothed her nightmares, and worked overtime without complaint. And yet here she was, being accused like some stranger caught trespassing. But what Lawrence didn't know, what nobody in this room knew, was that Olivia had one silent witness. In Amelia's nursery, nestled beside the crib, a baby monitor quietly recorded everything. It had been running last night, the same night the bracelet went missing. As Lawrence's voice rose again, the door creaked open. Mrs. Winslow stepped in, her expression unreadable. In her hands was the baby monitor, its small screen glowing with a frozen image of Olivia sitting in the nursery chair, holding Amelia. "I think," Mrs. Winslow said slowly, "we should watch this before we say anything else." Olivia's pulse quickened. Whatever was on that footage could end her nightmare, or make it far worse. Mrs. Winslow crossed the room with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. The soft click of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound as she set the baby monitor down on the table between them. Lawrence folded his arms, still bristling. "What is this supposed to prove?" Mrs. Winslow didn't answer right away. Her manicured fingers navigated the buttons until the screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to see the nursery bathed in the warm glow of a night lamp. Olivia sat in the rocking chair, Amelia nestled against her chest, fast asleep. For a moment the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the monitor's speaker. Then movement appeared in the corner of the frame. A tall, broad figure slipping quietly into the nursery. The face wasn't visible at first, but the body language was unmistakably casual, as if the intruder belonged there. Olivia's heart pounded as she watched her own image remain still, unaware. She remembered that moment now. The deep lull of Amelia's breathing had pulled her into a trance-like calm. Her eyes closed as she rocked gently. On the screen, the figure moved toward the dresser. A glint of metal caught the camera's eye, the diamond bracelet, lying atop a folded blanket. The figure pocketed it without hesitation, then slipped back out of the nursery. The silence in the Winslow study was electric. Lawrence's jaw clenched as Mrs. Winslow pressed pause. The face had been caught in the last frame before the figure left the room. It was not Olivia. It was Charles, the Winslows' longtime chauffeur. Lawrence blinked, his anger faltering, replaced by something heavier, confusion, disbelief. This doesn't make sense," he muttered. Olivia said nothing, her hands still in her lap, but her back straightened ever so slightly. The monitor had spoken for her. Mrs. Winslow's eyes stayed fixed on her husband. "It makes perfect sense. You accused the wrong person." Lawrence glanced at Olivia, his lips parting as if to speak, but before he could form the words, the butler cleared his throat. "Sir, Charles left the property early this morning. He hasn't returned." The realization hit like a cold draft through the room. The man Lawrence had trusted for over a decade had just vanished, with the bracelet. Olivia allowed herself a single slow breath, but the knot in her stomach didn't unravel. She was innocent, yes, but in the Winslow mansion, innocence didn't always guarantee safety. especially now when she knew the chauffeur's theft might only be the beginning. Lawrence sank into the high-backed leather chair behind his desk, running a hand through his perfectly combed hair until it stood slightly askew. The fire that had fueled his accusations just minutes ago was gone, replaced by something more dangerous: quiet calculation. "Find him," he ordered the butler, his voice low but edged with steel. "Now." The butler nodded and disappeared, the echo of his hurried footsteps fading down the hall. Olivia stood still, unsure if she should leave or wait. Mrs. Winslow glanced at her, a look that was part apology, part silent acknowledgement. "You should sit," she said softly, gesturing to the chair opposite her husband. Olivia didn't move. "I'd rather stand." Her voice was calm, but the undercurrent of hurt was clear. Lawrence leaned forward. "I misjudged you. That's obvious now." Obvious, Olivia thought bitterly. A public accusation in front of staff wasn't something a simple misjudgment could erase. Mrs. Winslow's eyes narrowed on her husband, but before she could speak, the baby monitor crackled, a faint tinny sound. The screen had gone dark after the playback, but now the audio channel was alive again. At first it was just muffled noises, then a voice, male, hurried, almost desperate. "Have to get it. Before they find out, she can't know." "Not yet." Olivia froze. She recognized the voice immediately. Charles. Lawrence snatched up the monitor, scrolling back in the stored recordings. Another clip appeared, this one from earlier that morning after Olivia had left Amelia in her crib. Charles was in the nursery again, speaking on a phone pressed tightly to his ear. "It's worth more than enough to cover the treatment," he said, glancing toward the door. "I'll get it to you tonight. Don't worry, they'll just think someone else took it." Mrs. Winslow's hand flew to her mouth. "Treatment?" she whispered. Lawrence frowned, confusion etching lines into his face. Treatment for what? The monitor clip ended abruptly as Charles left the room, but the words hung heavy in the air. Olivia felt her anger cooling into something more complicated, suspicion tangled with sympathy. "He wasn't stealing for himself," she said quietly. "He was helping someone." Lawrence shook his head. "That doesn't excuse it." "Maybe not," Olivia replied, her gaze steady on him. "But it explains it. And if you want to find him, you need to know who he was helping." Mrs. Winslow's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's his sister. She's been sick for years." Olivia turned sharply toward her. "Are you new?" "I knew she wasn't well," Mrs. Winslow admitted. "I didn't know it was this bad." Somewhere in the house, the front door slammed. The butler's hurried footsteps returned, but this time they weren't alone. The study door burst open, and the butler stepped inside, breathless, followed by two security guards in dark uniforms. Between them, his hands bound in front of him, was Charles. He looked smaller somehow, his broad shoulders hunched, his usual crisp chauffeur's cap missing. There was no defiance in his eyes, only a weary resignation, as if the fight had drained out of him long before he walked through the door. "Sir, we found him in the parking lot of St. Mary's Hospital," one of the guards said. "He was trying to pawn the bracelet to pay a medical bill." Olivia's chest tightened. St. Mary's wasn't just any hospital. It was where her own mother had been treated for pneumonia years ago. She knew their policies well. They didn't turn patients away, but their billing department could hound you into the ground. Lawrence stood, his hands pressed flat against the desk. "Why didn't you come to me, Charles? Why steal?" Charles met his gaze. "Because I knew you'd say no." His voice was quiet but steady. "I've been working for you for 13 years, Mr. Winslow. I've seen how you handle charity cases." Lawrence flinched at the bluntness. Mrs. Winslow shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Charles continued, glancing at Olivia. "I didn't want her blamed. I made sure she was in the nursery when I took it. Figured you'd check the footage, see it was me, and come after me directly." Olivia's brow furrowed. "But you didn't count on them confronting me before watching the footage." A faint shadow of shame crossed Charles's face. "No, I didn't." Mrs. Winslow broke the tense silence. "Who's in the hospital, Charles?" "My sister," he replied. "Kidney failure. She's been on the transplant list for 2 years. Last night her condition got worse. They said she needs an emergency procedure," or he trailed off, swallowing hard. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Lawrence exhaled slowly, his eyes softening but not entirely losing their edge. "You could have asked." "I couldn't risk it," Charles said simply. "She doesn't have time for red tape and pride." Olivia found herself stepping forward before she realized it. "Then maybe the question isn't why he stole," she said, her voice firm, "but why someone who's served this family for over a decade felt stealing was his only option." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Winslow's eyes flicked between her husband and Olivia, her expression unreadable. But before anyone could answer, one of the guards cleared his throat. "Sir, the hospital called while we were on the way back. They said Charles's sister's condition is deteriorating fast." Lawrence's gaze hardened, but this time the anger wasn't aimed at Olivia. Lawrence's jaw tightened, but his eyes flickered toward Mrs. Winslow. She was watching him closely, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly on the desk. The look she gave him in private when she wanted him to think, not react. "Remove the cuffs," he told the guards finally. They exchanged a glance, but obeyed. Charles rubbed his wrists, though he didn't look relieved. "If you're going to fire me, just say it," he muttered. "You're not going anywhere," Lawrence said, his voice low but decisive. "Not until your sister gets the treatment she needs." Olivia blinked in surprise. "So, you're helping him?" Lawrence looked at her, and for the first time since this morning, his expression carried something other than authority. It was reluctant, yes, but there was also a glimmer of shame. "I accused you of something I didn't see with my own eyes. I was wrong. Fixing this won't erase that, but maybe it'll keep someone else from paying the price." Charles's head dropped, emotion tightening his voice. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let me handle the bill," Lawrence replied, "and that you'll bring my wife's bracelet back to her as soon as possible." "I still have it," Charles admitted. He reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket and placed the bracelet gently on the desk, as if it were made of glass. Mrs. Winslow took it and closed her hand around it without looking at him. Instead, her gaze drifted to Olivia. "You've been quiet." Olivia hesitated. The knot of tension in her chest hadn't fully loosened. "I'm glad Charles' sister will get help," she said. "But I won't pretend this didn't happen. You accused me in front of the staff, Mr. Winslow. I have a life outside this house, a reputation." Her words cut through the room like a blade. Charles shifted uneasily. Lawrence met her eyes. "You're right. What do you want me to do?" The question caught her off guard, not because he asked, but because she could tell he meant it. She thought for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Finally, she spoke. "Tell them, everyone in this house. Tell them exactly what happened, and that I was innocent." Lawrence gave a single curt nod. "Done." Mrs. Winslow stood. "And after that," she said, glancing between her husband and Olivia, "we go to St. Mary's together. No more secrets, no more pride. We're seeing Charles's sister tonight." A flicker of warmth touched Olivia's chest, the first since the nightmare began. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. Because if Charles had been desperate enough to steal, it meant there were cracks in the Winslow empire that money alone couldn't fix. The gleaming luxury SUV pulled up in front of St. Mary's Hospital just after sunset, its headlights cutting through the dim glow of the street lamps. Lawrence was behind the wheel, silent, his eyes fixed ahead. In the back seat, Olivia sat beside Mrs. Winslow, while Charles stared out the opposite window, his hands clasped tightly as if in prayer. Inside, the hospital was a world away from the marble perfection of the Winslow estate. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic. The walls were painted a tired shade of pale green, and the corridors hummed with the steady beeping of machines and hurried footsteps of nurses. They found Charles's sister, Denise, in a small room at the end of the hall. Her skin was pale, her eyes heavy-lidded but alert. A nurse hovered nearby, adjusting a drip. "Charlie!" Denise's voice was raspy but warm as her eyes lit up at the sight of her brother. "You didn't have to." "I did," Charles interrupted gently, taking her hand. "And you're going to be okay." Lawrence stepped forward, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Ms. Turner." He stopped, realizing he had used the wrong name. "Denise, I'm Lawrence Winslow. I'm here to cover your procedure. No strings." She blinked at him, confused. "Why would you—" Mrs. Winslow placed a hand on her husband's arm, answering for him. "Because it's the right thing to do." The nurse glanced up from the chart. "Sir, the sooner we process payment, the sooner we can get her into surgery. It's time-sensitive." Lawrence nodded and stepped out with the nurse, leaving Olivia and Mrs. Winslow by the bedside. Denise's gaze drifted to Olivia. "You work for him." Olivia hesitated. "Yes." Denise studied her, as if weighing her character in a single glance. "Then you've seen what he's like when he thinks he's in the right." The comment landed heavy, but Olivia only said, "I've seen a lot in the last 24 hours. Charles looked up from where he sat beside the bed. She was the one they accused, Dee, of stealing the bracelet. Denise's eyes widened. "But they had proof it wasn't her," Charles said quietly. "But not before—" He broke off, his jaw tightening. not before it almost ruined her. Mrs. Winslow, still standing, didn't interrupt, but her eyes were fixed on Olivia with a kind of recognition, as if she understood exactly what that public humiliation had felt like. Lawrence returned minutes later, paperwork in hand. "It's done. She'll be prepped within the hour." Denise squeezed her brother's hand, tears forming. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered again. "Yes, I did," Charles replied, "and they did too." But as the family gathered around Denise, Olivia caught something in Lawrence's expression. A flash of unease, almost guilt, that didn't belong to this moment. It was as though the act of helping had reminded him of something or someone from his own past. Denise had been wheeled away for surgery, leaving the small hospital room quiet, except for the faint hum of machines from the hallway. Charles stood by the window, hands shoved deep in his pockets, while Mrs. Winslow checked her phone for updates from the nurses' station. Olivia lingered by the doorway, debating whether to slip out and give them privacy. But then she noticed Lawrence, standing still, staring at the empty hospital bed with an expression that didn't fit the moment. It wasn't pride or even relief, it was haunted. "You look like you've been here before," Olivia said quietly. He didn't look up. "I have." Charles turned from the window. "What's that supposed to mean?" Lawrence's voice was low but steady. "My younger sister, 20 years ago. Same hospital, same diagnosis. Kidney failure." Mrs. Winslow's head snapped toward him, surprise flickering across her face. "You never told me that." "She didn't make it," Lawrence continued, eyes still fixed on the bed. "We didn't have the kind of money then that I do now. And the insurance..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "They said she could wait for the transplant list. She couldn't." The room was still. Even the muffled hospital noises outside seemed to fade. "That's why you looked at Denise like that," Olivia realized. "You saw her and thought of your sister." Lawrence finally met her gaze. "I saw her, and I saw what happens when you wait too long. I couldn't let it happen again." Charles' voice was softer now, stripped of the edge it had carried all day. "If I'd known that, maybe I would have trusted you enough to ask." Lawrence gave a small, bitter smile. "Maybe I would have listened." Mrs. Winslow stepped forward, her tone gentle but firm. "Then maybe this is the start of something different. For all of us." The weight in the room shifted slightly, the air easier to breathe. Olivia still remembered the sting of accusation, but for the first time she sensed that something good might grow out of it, not just for Charles and Denise, but for the Winslows themselves. Before she could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "She's in recovery. Surgery went well. You can see her in about an hour." A wave of relief swept over Charles, his shoulders dropping for the first time since morning. Lawrence exhaled slowly, but Olivia noticed his hand flex at his side, as though he were bracing himself. She realized then, for him, this wasn't over. There was something else he hadn't said, and when it came, she had the feeling it would change everything again. An hour later, they were allowed back into Denise's room. She was pale but smiling faintly, her eyes fluttering open when Charles took her hand. Relief filled the space like warm light, but Lawrence hung back near the door, watching the scene as though he didn't belong in it. Olivia noticed. She crossed the room and stood beside him, her voice low. "You've been quiet." His eyes stayed on Denise. "Because I'm still deciding whether to tell the rest of it." Olivia tilted her head. "The rest of what?" He glanced toward Mrs. Winslow, who was speaking softly with the nurse, then back at Olivia. "The reason my sister didn't get her transplant in time wasn't just money or bad luck. It was because my father refused to sell part of the business to pay for it. Said, family comes second to the empire. I swore I'd never be like him. But when Charles didn't come to me, maybe I already was." Olivia studied him. "And accusing me before checking the facts, was that him too?" His jaw tightened. "Maybe. Or maybe it was just me being exactly what I've spent years claiming I'm not." There was no defense in his tone, no attempt to dress it up. Just truth, raw and uncomfortable. Charles overheard, his voice quiet but steady. "If you'd been the man I thought you were, I wouldn't have stolen the bracelet. But if I'd been the man I should have been, I'd have told you the truth in the first place." Mrs. Winslow turned from the bedside. "So maybe you both have something to learn from this." The air settled into an uneasy but honest silence. Denise's slow, steady breathing was the only sound. Lawrence finally stepped forward and placed an envelope on the bedside table. "For follow-up treatment. No cameras, no announcements. Just between us." Charles looked at the envelope, then up at him. "Thank you." Lawrence gave a curt nod, then turned to Olivia. "And as for you, I'll make that announcement when we get home. The whole staff will know exactly what happened, and exactly who deserves their respect." Olivia held his gaze. That's a start. They left the hospital under the pale glow of the streetlights. The city hummed quietly around them, but in the car, no one spoke for the first few minutes. There was too much to process. The accusations, the betrayal, the surgery, and the truths that had been dragged out into the open. As they drove back toward the glittering lights of the Winslow estate, Olivia looked out at the passing streets and thought about how quickly a life could flip upside down, and how sometimes the person you least expect to change is the one who surprises you most. In the rearview mirror, Lawrence caught her reflection and gave the smallest of nods. It wasn't an apology, but it was something, and for now, that was enough.